Welcome to the first edition of Talk Sustainability with Sandeep. I'm your host Sandeep Raghuvanshi, and over the course of this podcast series, we will talk about corporate sustainability from an Indian context. We will investigate and identify the source of sustainability challenges, analyze existing solutions, and spark conversations with the frontliners and changemakers to get insights on how to address these challenges. Let's begin our investigations with one of the most burning, yet not much talked about, problem of India today: food wastage. So sometime back, one of my colleague, he forwarded me an article which had an interesting story. So it was a story of this gentleman who was transiting through the Mumbai airport, and he had a few hours until his next flight. So he was at one of the lounges. And while he was at the lounge, he was observing the behavior of the passengers with a particular interest in their eating habits. So, what they were browsing at the food counter, what they were picking, what they were eating, and what they were throwing away. Now, his interest was a little more than an average passenger's interest because he also happened to be the business head of the food and beverage firm that managed that particular lounge. And when he was observing the waste bins, he observed something interesting. He saw there was an unusually large portion of desserts that were being thrown away by the passengers. So when he went back to his office, he ordered an audit of the waste bins for a period of time. The findings were quite interesting. They found that the passengers were interested in the dessert section, and each passenger took 2, 3, or sometimes even larger number of desserts on their plates. But they were not interested in eating the entire portions of each dessert. They wanted to taste multiple desserts, so they will take one spoon or one bite of each dessert and they will throw away the rest. So this finding led to a decision being taken to reduce the portion size of each dessert and increase the number of desserts in that section. So this potentially increased the passenger satisfaction because they were interested in that particular section. But at the same time, it reduced the amount of waste that was being generated. This saving amounted to 1.2 crore rupees or 12 million rupees per year. Now, this is quite significant. So, food is money, and food waste saving is money saved. This is not surprising. What is surprising is the scant attention that food waste gets in the general discourse. And especially since it is such a massive problem. How big is this problem? As per a report by Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations, there is a staggering 1.3 billion tons of food being lost every year. India is a huge producer of all kinds of food, and the loss as a percentage in India is higher than world average. In India, around 40% of all food that is produced gets lost somewhere in the value chain. Now, where exactly this food loss happens? There are multiple hotspots in the entire value chain, so it is not possible to put finger on a particular point in the value chain where this maximum loss happens. But the food loss happens continuously, from the farms where you have some crops which are unharvested to the transportation, during the processing, during storage, during the groceries, and then in the kitchen and the consumer plate. So in the entire value chain from farm to fork, there are multiple hotspots where the food loss happens. Just over half of this happens before it is processed or before it reaches the grocery stores, and just under half of the total food loss happens after the processing and after the grocery stores. And it is not just the financial cost of this food that we are talking about. Agriculture is one of the most water intensive activities. So any food that is wasted in a way brings certain amount of drain in the water resources of the areas where the raw materials were produced. More food also means more pesticides, more fertilizers, and more degradation of arable lands. There is also a linkage between the food that is being wasted and the loss of biodiversity on the planet. Because of the high amount of loss, there is more food that has to be produced per unit of consumption, which means more land in which it has to be produced, which comes at the cost of forest covers, and that sort of results in loss of biodiversity. One of the biggest sources of food waste are the large scale kitchens, from the food service industry, from the hotels, from resorts, from restaurants, and so on. It is estimated that around 30% of the total food that is prepared for a wedding gets lost. And how many are we talking about? There are close to 1 crore weddings and parties that happen in India per year. Now, in the weddings in particular, against a standard portion size of around 450 grams, it is estimated that each plate has between 1 kilogram to 2 kilogram of food, and most of it gets thrown away. Once this food is thrown, it starts sort of another chain reaction that constitutes to close to half of the entire municipal solid waste that is being collected. A small portion of that food that is collected goes into making compost or animal feed, but bulk of that food as of today ends up in landfills, and in those landfills it goes through aerobic and anaerobic digestion process. In fact, results in generation of methane, which is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. It is estimated that the food waste collectively globally is responsible for around 8% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. To put it in a slightly different perspective, if the food waste was a separate country, it would be the third largest emitter in the whole world. And that's the environmental part of it. At the same time, the food waste also means it's an excess food. It's too much food to be consumed. We are very much aware of the scenarios of too little food in the same country. India ranks 102nd in the World Hunger Index. And in most of the places in cities, you have the poverty living side by side, prosperity. Now, on one hand, the food waste is real money and it results in certain cost savings for the businesses and whoever are the consumers. On the other hand, it has the other impacts on the environmental and social side. So it looks like that this is one thing that should just unite all of us together, and there should be no reasons why anyone should have any objections to be done, for anything to be done on this, and we should be able to achieve a perfect solution. But unfortunately, nothing is that simple in real life. One of the arguments that is generally made by a lot of NGOs and others is about the ethics and morality, that the food wastage that is happening from any food service industry or from any of these, let's say, parties and other places, that should be curtailed. So it should be the responsibility of those consumers or those businesses to ensure that there is no food, and hence they should try to limit the consumption. They should reduce the consumption to achieve that. But that ethical argument doesn't really work very well. And why it doesn't work is because of the way in which our entire industry is currently structured. You have the entire industry from the production to the endpoint sales. It is geared for selling more and more. The entire incentive structures are to sell more. Now, using a method and mechanism whereby you are able to sell more and you are able to sell continuously, you are able to keep the stores, the consumer facing stores, busy the entire 12 months. And with e-commerce, now it is any hour of the day. So it's almost 24/7 for all 365 days a year. Most of these stores happen to be in malls where you have the continuous rentals, and hence it is important for them to be able to maximize the sales, to be able to continue to remain profitable. That triggers to keep the supply chains and warehouses and the production facilities to be occupied, and to make sure that the costs are distributed in every single minute of production. If the consumption was to be curtailed, if that was a way for this to be achieved, then that would mean that there will be some slack capacity that will get created in the entire value chain, the way it is structured right now. Does that work? I have a personal experience with one of the food companies, which is in Saudi Arabia. And this company has a particular product which is highly seasonal in nature. Almost 90 to 95% sales of this particular food product happens during a particular festival. Now, they have been struggling for years to find ways to fill capacity when they have a slack because of the non-season period. And they have tried to make all sorts of investment of different products, but nothing has really worked efficiently. A lot of projects just failed. Some of the projects have been sort of marginal success. So the point is that it is not always possible to have an alternative use for your facilities and infrastructure if you try to curtail down on the consumption. And it also goes against the very interest of the organization, where the fiduciary responsibility of the management and the entire incentive structure of all the staff is try to maximize their sales and not try to cut down on the sales. So the question then comes out is that, okay, how can we find a balance between the economic interest of all these organizations and the food waste? So the first question that comes out then is that whenever we are talking about this loss, on whose account this loss is. Is it a pre-sales loss or it's a post-sale loss? If it is a pre-sale loss, then this is a cost for the selling organization, and it is in their interest to minimize these costs so that they can maximize their profits while not affecting the sales. If it is a post-sales loss, then the selling organization is in fact not that much concerned because it is not a cost on them anymore. They have already sold it. Unless and until the collection costs and other costs are on them. And the separation of the two is also not that very simple. Take, for example, grocery stores. Now, in grocery retail business, the business model and strategies are designed to produce more waste. For example, the main drivers for food sale at a grocery store is also the primary cause of their waste, which is the product displays have to be always stocked. They should never be empty. You need to have aesthetic and these perfectly shaped, beautiful fruits and vegetables, which means that anything that is not perfect in shape and look, that will probably turn up into a waste. To have these oversized packages so that you can maximize the sale at the point of purchase by the client. And also in terms of having the availability of prepared food until closing hours if they have a food section also. Now, having the prepared food being full until the late hours, of course, results in a certain excess inventory that will be left over at the end of the day. Similarly, if we look at the industry beyond grocery in restaurants, the similar kind of structures we see over there as well. The primary drivers of food waste of a restaurant industry are offering of large portions and the extensive menu choices that restaurants have, and which are also the primary sales strategy of those restaurants to maximize sales and attract maximum number of customers coming to them. Lately, there has been an increased tendency of offering of large buffets. Now, these buffets, again, just like a grocery store shelves, these buffets have to be fully stocked at all points of time, and they have to remain stocked until the closing hours of that buffet, which of course results in a certain amount of excess inventory at the end of the hours of the buffet. Similar to what happens during the wedding parties, the buffets are known to have higher percentage of wastage coming out of the customer plates because they are not paying for each of those items that are being picked. Now, in these kind of scenarios, it becomes a little tricky and a little difficult to be able to separate the waste generation from the sales maximization, and unless and until a holistic exercise is undertaken by these organizations to see how they can minimize the waste without impacting the sales, without hurting themselves, till that point of time, it is very difficult to find a right solution. And so far, companies have included these costs of wastage in their economics. So they do not have a separate line item for a food waste, but the food waste, they are aware of the food waste, and the total cost of the food waste sort of gets distributed across their operations, and it gets buried somewhere in their operational budgets, and it gets factored in the selling price and in the costs that they have budgeted for. Now, since it is not being measured separately, the attention generally would not go into minimizing those waste unless until it goes beyond a certain trends that they have been witnessing. But of course, it's a cost, and they are aware that if it's a cost in their books and if they're able to minimize it, that should boost the overall profitability of the firm, And more money would mean either more money to the shareholders, or it would mean better pay and better working conditions, more money available for investments, or better payment for the producers like farmers, or better service for customers. So there definitely are benefits of that. However, the challenge primarily remains is that there is a belief that given that these food costs are not being identified separately and they are somewhere in the process, and the way this industry operates, any change that will be required to reduce these food wastages would be either disruptive in nature, or it will be too expensive in terms of resources, or in terms of time, or in terms of execution. So it could be difficult from execution perspective. However, that is not true. In 2017, a massive study was done across 17 countries, and more than 1,200 organizations participated in that study. And it found that the organizations that attempted to reduce the waste, and they did proper studies, and they initiated certain process changes, they found that there were a lot of low-hanging fruits that were available, which gave them quick successes with very small amount of investments. And then there were more sort of radical changes that had a return of investments. But almost across the board, the return of investment profile was very strong. And the median benefit was around 14:1. So for every $1 invested, more than half of the use cases generated returns in excess of 14 times of the amount invested. Take an example of a manufacturer. Now, this manufacturer converts ingredients into certain food product, and it conducted an audit of the total waste that was being generated from their manufacturing processes. They found that once a container was marked as empty, it still contained around 7% by weight of the ingredients that were stored in that container. Now, these ingredients were quite expensive in terms of the monetary value. And by doing a certain training for the staff and making certain process changes, they were able to eliminate this wastage in the containers, in those empty containers, quote unquote. Now, because the total cost that was involved in making this training and the process changes was very, very small compared to the value of the ingredients that were being now retained or being prevented from getting wasted, the return of investment was few hundred times of the amount that was invested. Similarly, there is an unfounded belief, or there is a belief in the restaurants, that if they were to do something beyond their sales to reduce the wastage on the customer plates, that could in fact have a negative impact on the sales that they generate. But studies have shown that any savings that customers get from the reduction of wastage in their plates is generally spent back to the same seller for more higher value items, and hence there is sort of a trading up that happens, and there has been no negative impact on the sales. If anything, the trust of the customers on that particular outlet increases, and their loyalty and the overall lifetime value of those customers is known to be higher. Now, when we talk about the kind of sale processes where there is the food waste is entirely in the domain of the cost of the organization, such as in cafeterias, which is one of the big sources of food wastage that comes out, is from the cafeterias that are run by these large technical parks, the IT companies, the large industrial organizations. Now, over here, the primary cause of wastage is that because of the regulations, most of these cafeterias are not allowed to cook food on the premises. So they have to get the cooked food brought in for serving, and they can only do some heatings and other steaming and some of the basic processes, but the basic cooking cannot be done within those premises. This requires very high level of precision in their forecasting of the total amount of demand that will be generated from the consumers of their food on a particular day. and any mismatch of the forecasts would result in certain excess food that will be wasted. Now, if particular food service company, which operates around 23 such large workplace in Western European country, it it invested certain amount of resources to quantify the total food loss and waste, and they found the hotspots which were resulting in the wastage because of overproduction. They also found there was certain out of date food and some the uneaten meals by the customers because of the differences in the portion sizes that were served to them and what they were actually consuming. And based on this, a certain set of decisions were taken to reduce the total food waste. And it turned out that this exercise resulted in benefits for this company with a benefit cost ratio of 25x, which is for every $1 invested in this whole process resulted in $25 of savings for that company. So what it shows is that while any reduction in the food waste requires a certain amount of investments to be made, but the return profile on those investments is overwhelmingly positive. So why more organizations are not doing that currently? There are two main barriers in organizations not going and making those investments to reduce the food waste. One is, in general, lack of awareness of the scale of food waste in the business. And as the old adage goes, only what gets measured gets managed. So since they are not measuring, they are not reporting, they are not identifying the food waste as a separate line item, there is no focused attention that goes into savings. They are not aware of the scale and the monetary loss that is happening because of that. And the second barrier is an effective business case for change, because there are a lot of preconceived notions and apprehensions that this might result in loss of sales or loss of the profitability of the organization. And these are the two primary barriers why the organizations are not even making an attempt in this particular direction. But that said, one thing that we have to accept is that any solution that one has to identify, one has to work on, has to be in accordance with the overall economic interests of the industry that is functioning, because we are talking about a large industry, we are talking about a set way in which every part of this value chain functions, and hence a disruption of a completely new way of a model would require the business models of every single player to be different, to be a new way, and that requires a massive amount of training, the entire new set of infrastructure, and those changes are prohibitively expensive for anything radical to be thought through. So the food waste is here to stay. That is one important part that we have to understand, that the food waste is not going to get eliminated completely. We can reduce it, definitely. There are a lot of potentials for all the players in the value chain to work to reduce the food waste, but elimination of food waste, at least in the near or medium term future, is not a likely possibility. And there are multiple reasons for that. One of the reasons is that with growing urbanization, with growing affluence of people, the value or the cost of the food as part of their overall disposable income, or as part of the total consumption spend of a particular household, is smaller and smaller, and hence food waste does not hurt them economically. Now, a lot of these things may change. There is an increasing trend around the world for governments to increase the cost of the waste generation so that you can induce certain behavioral change through the market pricing mechanisms. But despite that, there will be a certain amount of waste that will continue to be generated, and that cannot be eliminated completely just by improvement of efficiency in the value chain. So what to do with this excess food? Now, the moment we think about the excess prepared food that is fit for human consumption, the images of people with less nutrition or lack of adequate nutrition comes to mind. And given that in urban scenarios, such pockets of people are staying in close vicinity of the pockets where this excess food is being generated, it looks just logical that if someone could just connect the excess food from the deficit, this should be a perfect solution. And there are several NGOs which are active in the field of food rescue, who regularly collect this excess food, and they create some kind of a food bank from where then they distribute the food to the deficient communities. But this model is not as simple as it looks, because for this model to work in a effective manner and in a scalable manner, it is important that the supply and demand is predictable. There are complaints that come out from a lot of these food rescue organizations is that even if they have availability of edible food, they do not have takers for it. So for orphanages and for a lot of other such communities, they need advance notification of food being available so that they do not do any production of their food. Secondly, they want a certain continuity of the kind of food that will be available to them, which essentially means that they need more visibility in the future of the food generation, which by the very nature of this whole activity is not possible. So then what is the solution? Now, the solution for an effective recycling of this food waste has to match the scale of the problem. And we are talking about a very large quantity of food waste being generated. Now, this food waste, we are calling it a food waste because it does not have any more economic value left in it. However, it is a combination of complex carbohydrates and a lot of other nutrients which can be extracted and converted into valuable products. So this food is much more than something that just needs to be converted back into soil by way of composting or just to be fed to animals. Now, hence, a intermediate or ancillary industry has to come, which has to see this food waste in form of a biorefinery model, where the highest value items are extracted first and progressively it moves towards lower value items till you reach a tipping point beyond which it does not have a further economic value for extraction, and then it can be converted into compost or in any other form of low value items, so that the entire food waste is used in some kind of byproducts to be generated out of it. Now, while this intermediate industry does the research and development to come up with solutions and make certain products which are of high quality and high value products, there has to be an emergence of the consuming industry for such products also, so that it can create a necessary pull, and then you effectively have found the closed loop solution, which is the basis of your circular economy. As they say, it's a shame to waste the waste, because nothing is a waste, everything is a resource and it has value locked in it. The only challenge that we have is that how we can access that value that is locked in these kind of resources. Over the last few weeks, I have had some very interesting and detailed conversations with some of the experts in the food and waste management industries. In the next few episodes, we will investigate the food waste challenge of India with a 360-degree perspective from all stakeholders involved, including food service industry, waste management, regulators, and solution providers. If you are someone who has useful information on this subject or have success stories that you would like to share, please reach out to me. We need to build a community from all walks of life across the value chain to do our little bit in solving this massive problem. There are many things that divide us, but planet Earth unites us. Stay tuned for more content on sustainability. Take care and stay safe.